There's a hush that comes over the plains when the last light leaves the hills, the kind of quiet that makes you feel smaller, softer, part of something older than memory. Tonight, we'll follow that quiet back through time, to a different kind of frontier, not the one written in maps and ledgers, but the one carved in code and imagination. This is a story about how artists, engineers, and dreamers built a world that could breathe, and how that world refused to die. From half-finished prototypes to roaring acclaim, from deserts of silence to a chorus of digital hoofbeats, it's a tale of creation, decay, and the strange peace that follows both. So draw closer to the fire. The air is cool, the wind patient. The story of Red Dead Redemption is waiting in the smoke, and it begins, as all good stories do, at the edge of a map that isn't finished yet. Part 1. The Prototype Dream. It's hard to believe that the story of one of gaming's most soulful westerns began not in a blaze of glory, but in quiet confusion. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was no Red Dead Redemption, no Arthur or John, not even a Rockstar logo tied to dusty plains. There was a small studio in San Diego called Angel Studios, an ambitious team of programmers and artists experimenting with open-world landscapes, with how sand might drift across a polygonal desert, how sunlight might fall through canyon air. They were chasing a feeling, even if they didn't yet have the words for it. Their prototype was rough, more bones than flesh. It carried the working title Red Dead Revolver, a quirky shooter about bounty hunters and duels, stitched together from code that still smelled of the arcades. Capcom was the publisher then, and the project flickered uncertainly between cultures and continents. Half Western grit, half Japanese arcade pacing. For a while, it limped along. Too strange to cancel outright, too promising to ignore. But the industry moves like weather, and the forecast turned cold. Capcom withdrew, budgets froze, and Angel Studios stood there with a pile of dreams that no one seemed to want. Then came Rockstar. They had just finished turning Grand Theft Auto 3 into a phenomenon and were searching for their next horizon. When they looked at Angel's prototype, they didn't see failure. They saw a seed, a chance to tell an American myth with all the melancholy of a dying sun. Rockstar purchased the studio, renamed it Rockstar San Diego, and quietly began the slow act of resurrection. What they inherited wasn't just code, it was a question. Could an open world capture the soul of the frontier without feeling like a theme park? For months, the answer looked uncertain. The technology of the early 2000s could fake explosions and car chases, but not the subtle rhythm of hooves in dust. The team wrestled with limitations that would make modern developers wince. Tiny memory pools, rigid animation trees, engines that could barely render a horizon. Yet in those constraints a strange poetry took root. Developers began obsessing over small truths. They studied how cloth folds over a saddle horn, how light changes as it bounces off a pale mesa, how the air itself seems to hum at noon. They built tools to bend the game engine into cooperation, teaching it to draw not skyscrapers but cacti, not traffic lights, but the lonely tilt of telegraph poles. They weren't just coding, they were listening for what the world wanted to say. When Red Dead Revolver finally released in 2004, it was quirky, rough-edged, almost theatrical. Yet beneath its pulpy tone lived the promise of something deeper, a sense that violence in games could be personal rather than performative, that dust and silence might speak louder than gunfire. For Rockstar San Diego, it was both an ending and a beginning. They had proven they could conjure a West that felt right. Now they wanted one that meant something. In the years that followed, prototypes multiplied. Someone pinned concept art of a lone rider against a vast canyon wall and wrote a single word beneath it: redemption. The word lingered like smoke. What if the next game didn't chase heroism at all? What if it chased consequence? The team began sketching a world that wasn't about being the fastest gun, but about surviving the slow unraveling of an age. They imagined characters who'd already outlived their legends, men who had tasted progress and found it bitter. They wrote diary fragments, short vignettes about families trying to stay together as railroads carved through their pastures. Every week the whiteboard filled with quiet tragedies, not boss fights. It was clear that something in Rockstar's tone was shifting. Meanwhile, technology evolved. The Rage engine was forming. Rockstar's internal toolkit meant to unify physics, animation, and terrain. Euphoria, a new procedural animation system, promised bodies that reacted, stumbled, and recovered in ways too human to script. It was messy, unpredictable, alive, and that made it perfect. Because the West, as they imagined it, was never tidy. They began walking through virtual deserts late at night, testing shadows, experimenting with dust density, adjusting the rhythm of hoofbeats so that each gallop felt physical. They tuned sunsets like composers, layering gold over rust over mauve until the screen felt warm to the eyes. They gave every sound a heartbeat: wind sighing over rocks, vultures circling, boots sinking into clay. Each sensory detail was a line of verse in the long poem of the frontier. As months turned into years, the dream coalesced. A new name was whispered around the studio halls: Red Dead Redemption. It felt weighty, biblical. It promised a story about guilt and forgiveness, about the distance between what you've done and who you're trying to be. Inside that single word, redemption, the developers found their compass. The creative leads insisted on grounding everything in empathy. Every outlaw needed a reason. Every gunfight needed regret. They studied the moral architecture of Western cinema, not the glamorous shootouts, but the silences afterward. John Ford, Sergio Leone, Eastwood's loners, Peckinpah's weary soldiers. They became ghosts in the machine, whispering about pride and inevitability. Rockstar San Diego wasn't trying to romanticize the frontier. They were trying to build a requiem for it. They wanted players to ride not through history, but through memory, to feel the weight of something ending, even if they couldn't name it. And quietly, without press releases or trailers, they began forging the foundation for what would become one of gaming's most enduring pieces of digital Americana. The prototype dream had done its job. It had proven that a handful of polygons could hold a world, that a half-cancelled project could become a gospel of atmosphere, that sometimes the softest beginnings lead to the loudest legacies. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it, the faint creak of a saddle, a breeze sifting through sagebrush, a developer exhaling in relief as his code finally holds together. The long road west had started, not with a bang, but with a hush before dawn. Part 2. Building a Modern Western. By the late 2000s, the sun was rising again over Rockstar San Diego. The studio had weathered years of quiet experimentation, prototype after prototype, revisions that nobody outside those walls would ever see. But behind the curtains, something remarkable was happening. The West was beginning to breathe. The announcement came softly, almost modestly, in 2009, Red Dead Redemption, a name that sounded less like a sequel and more like a confession. For players, it promised gunfights, horseback chases, and the open desert. But for the people making it, the word redemption was the North Star guiding every decision. They weren't chasing spectacle anymore. They were chasing truth, how it feels to stand at the edge of an era and realize the world has moved on without you. From the beginning, the team wanted the game to be felt, not just played. They spoke of dust as if it were a character, of wind as if it carried a story. They wanted the world to feel indifferent, yet alive, to be so vast and convincing that you'd forget there were boundaries at all. Each sunrise had to look like it might be the last one. Each town had to carry its own heartbeat, the creak of a sign in the wind, the rustle of curtains, the low hum of an unseen piano through a saloon wall. Developers and designers worked side by side, obsessed with the texture of everything. They spent months just studying how horses move, how the muscle rolls under skin, how the mane catches light, how the weight shifts when galloping downhill. Every frame of animation was a conversation between artist and animal. The horse was not a tool or a menu option. It was your partner, your conscience, and sometimes your only friend in a place that didn't forgive easy. To make that relationship believable, programmers invented systems that didn't yet exist. The rage engine was taught to bend with the land, to let each hoof strike echo in the right way. Animators crafted hundreds of subtle behaviors. A flick of the ear, a nervous shuffle, a startled whinny. They even debated what kind of dust should rise when hooves hit dry clay versus when they trampled grass after rain. Those decisions might sound small, but the West is made of small things. It's the small things that make it real. And then there was John Marston. He was not designed as a hero, but as a man caught in a web of consequence. A voice both tired and hopeful, someone trying to undo the knots of his past one thread at a time. His journey wasn't about glory, it was about reckoning. Every quest, every line of dialogue, every weary glance toward the horizon was built around one quiet idea. Can a man who's done wrong ever make it right? The writers filled notebooks with short scenes and quiet moments, conversations between husband and wife, between a father and his son, between an outlaw and the ghosts of his own decisions. They wanted the game to whisper where others shouted. When you rode alone at sunset, the camera didn't cut to action or exposition. It just followed you patiently, letting the wind tell the story. Sometimes the most profound thing a game can do is simply wait with you. The studio's culture reflected that patience. Late nights bled into early mornings. Programmers slept on couches. Artists built landscapes by hand, one stone fence at a time. They created hundreds of animal species, each with unique behavior. They wrote weather that behaved like a living organism. Storms that built gradually. The smell of rain hinted at before a single drop fell. They tuned the light so it would glance off the canyons just right at 6:42 p.m. in the virtual summer. They didn't just simulate a frontier, they reincarnated it. Music, too, became an act of storytelling. Composer Woody Jackson approached the score as if he were scoring silence itself. He used handmade instruments, guitars strung with old bronze, harmonicas bent slightly out of tune, percussion recorded through the open doors of a barn. He wanted imperfection, because imperfection sounded human. His notes wandered like travelers with nowhere urgent to be. They entered scenes late and left early, as if reluctant to disturb the stillness. That restraint became the heartbeat of Red Dead Redemption. Music that didn't demand attention but earned it. Meanwhile, the open world was taking shape. A patchwork of deserts, plains, swamps, and towns stitched together so seamlessly that players would one day forget where one region ended and another began. Developers hid tiny vignettes everywhere. A woman stranded by the road, a hermit talking to himself by a river, a camp of travelers humming in the dark. Each event could pass unnoticed if you rode by too fast. That was the point. The game didn't need you to see everything. It only needed you to feel that everything was happening, with or without you. When previews finally reached the press, people didn't quite know what to make of it. Here was a Rockstar game without neon lights or punk anthems, without the speed and satire of Grand Theft Auto. Instead, this was a slow burn, dusty, deliberate, almost reverent. But those who played early builds noticed something rare, a sense of sincerity, a feeling that every animation, every mile of terrain, every passing cloud had been crafted not for shock, but for awe. As the May 2010 release date approached, the weight of expectation grew heavy. Within Rockstar, morale swung between exhaustion and hope. Teams refined missions, smoothed transitions, fought the usual bugs that haunt massive open worlds. Someone once described those final months as trying to paint a horizon while standing in quicksand. But somehow they pulled it off. The world held, the horse ran, the dust rose, the story began to sing, and then came release day. Players stepped into Marston's boots and onto the dusty plains of New Austin. They met Bonnie McFarlane and her ranch full of quiet resilience. They rode into Armadillo, heard the train whistle slice through heat, and felt the strange comfort of a world that moved at his own pace. Gamers who were used to adrenaline found themselves slowing down without meaning to, stopping to watch sunsets, listening to birds, lingering after missions just to feel the world breathe. Even now, all these years later, people remember that first ride into Mexico, the guitar picking up as the sun burned low, Jose Gonzalez's Far Away pouring out like a prayer. It wasn't a cutscene or a reward. It was a moment of pure stillness, an exhale after hours of noise. For the first time, many players felt something new in an open-world game. Peace. And then, slowly, that peace turned to reflection. Marston's story became a mirror for anyone who's ever tried to fix the unfixable, to rewrite a past written in ink. The game didn't lecture or moralize. It simply followed a man trying to do right by those he loved, even when fate was uninterested. When his tale finally closed, it left a silence heavy enough to feel sacred. People set their controllers down and just sat there. They didn't cheer. They breathed. They looked out at the digital sunset and understood something unspoken, that this wasn't just a Western. It was a eulogy for every version of ourselves that time leaves behind. In a medium obsessed with progress and power, Red Dead Redemption reminded the world of the beauty in stillness. It proved that patience could be as thrilling as action, that quiet could be louder than chaos, and that storytelling in games could reach the same emotional timbre as film or literature. By the end of 2010, Rockstar San Diego had done something extraordinary. They had taken a genre that seemed destined for nostalgia and given it new life. They had built a modern Western that didn't just borrow the look of old cinema. It borrowed its soul, and somewhere, deep inside that digital desert, you could almost hear the echo of a campfire crackling, the whisper of wind across prairie grass, and the faint, lingering question that would lead them to their next chapter. What comes after redemption? Part 3. Undead Interlude. Every great story, no matter how grounded, eventually reaches a night when the fire burns low and someone decides to tell a ghost tale. For Red Dead Redemption, that ghost tale arrived in the fall of 2010, only a few months after John Marston first rode into players' lives. It was called Undead Nightmare, and at first glance it looked like a joke, a Halloween season spin-off, a pulpy detour into the absurd. But underneath the green fog and the groaning silhouettes was something strangely sincere, almost tender, like a storyteller winking but never breaking faith with the world they built. When the expansion opens, the frontier you knew is different. The same fences, the same hills, the same dusty towns, but everything is off by half a heartbeat. Lantern light flickers too slow. Wind sighs through empty barns that still smell of hay. The familiar has become uncanny, as if the West itself has started to dream. That dissonance is what makes Undead Nightmare so haunting. It isn't just a world invaded by monsters, it's a world that seems to remember being alive. Rockstar treated the premise not as parody, but as folklore. They approached the apocalypse the way a frontier preacher might. Equal parts superstition, guilt, and grim humor. John Marston returns home to find his wife and son turned against him, and instead of rage, he meets it with disbelief and a stubborn devotion to set things right. He straps on his guns not out of revenge, but out of duty. The land has gone wrong, and someone must wander into the dark to restore balance. It's myth in miniature, a cowboy as reluctant saint. What keeps the story from collapsing under its own absurdity is tone. Rockstar knew exactly when to let the horror breathe and when to let irony cool the air. You meet nuns still praying in ruined churches, undertakers trying to reason with the dead, and fortune tellers who insist that this was all foretold. Every encounter feels like an echo of the main game's themes: sin, consequence, and the slow erosion of order. Even in Apocalypse, Marston remains a man trying to redeem himself, tending to strangers, offering hope in a hopeless place. The undead become mirrors of his own guilt, souls trapped between what they were and what they've done. From a design perspective, Undead Nightmare was a marvel of reuse. The same map, the same assets, completely recontextualized through color, lighting, and pacing. Developers bathed the world in green mist, drained the saturation from the horizon, and replaced the sun with a sickle-shaped moon that never seemed to set. Wildlife disappeared. New horrors took their place. You'd crest a ridge expecting coyotes, and hear instead the hollow moan of something that used to be human. The familiar became frightening, and yet peaceful in a way, because the rhythm of travel remained the same. Long rides, long silences, the gentle rhythm of hooves under a blood-red sky. It was still the West, just seen through the eyes of a fever dream. Players laughed, screamed, and strangely enough, relaxed. Many found themselves playing Undead Nightmare, not for the jump scares, but for the atmosphere. The misty nights, the slow tension, the satisfaction of clearing a town and watching its lanterns flicker back to life. It was restorative, even amid decay. And when the credits rolled, the sense of closure was different from the main game's tragedy. Where Red Dead Redemption ended with inevitability, Undead Nightmare ended with absurd grace. A resurrected Marston rising from his grave, still trying to do right, still carrying that eternal burden of duty. It was a wink to the player and a whispered promise that some stories never stay buried. Critics called it one of the best expansions ever made, but its real achievement was emotional rather than technical. It showed how flexible the Red Dead world could be, how tone could shift from solemn elegy to dark comedy without breaking. That flexibility would later give the team courage to attempt Red Dead Redemption 2, a prequel more tragic, more human, and even slower in his heartbeat. Undead Nightmare proved that the world itself was strong enough to hold contradictions, faith and fear, life and death, laughter and mourning. Looking back, you can see how the DLC deepened the mythology. In folklore, the dead walk because the living have unfinished business. In Rockstar's tale, the living keep moving because the past refuses to stay quiet. That circular logic, that haunting persistence, became the defining spirit of the series. It's why, even now, a decade later, players revisit those mist-soaked hills every October, chasing not terror but nostalgia. They ride through graveyards at midnight, listening to the wind, remembering how strange and alive that world felt when it first turned upside down. There's a line near the end, easy to miss, when a weary character remarks that maybe the world needed this cleansing, that maybe the dead rising was just nature's way of starting over. It's delivered half in jest, half in surrender. But it lands like a truth, because that's what the Red Dead saga has always been about. The world starting over again and again, and the few souls stubborn enough to keep walking through the smoke. If you're listening to this while drifting toward sleep, imagine it now. A prairie under a green moon, a rider moving slowly through fog, the clink of spurs, the sigh of wind, the faint strum of a haunted guitar. It's eerie, yes, but also comforting, because even in this nightmare the rhythm of life continues, hoofbeats, breath, heart, and somewhere deep in the dark, the whisper of a promise that tomorrow the sun will rise again. Part 4. The long tease to a larger tale. For a few quiet years after Undead Nightmare, the prairie went still. Rockstar moved on to other projects, and the Red Dead name settled into legend. Players spoke of it the way folks talk about a hometown they can't return to. Half memory, half longing. There were whispers, of course, an offhand comment in an interview, a line of code spotted by data miners, a rumor that the studio in San Diego had something big simmering in the dark, but nothing certain. Just the wind moving through rumor like it moves through wheat, soft, restless, promising rain. Then in October 2016, a picture appeared online, a red background, 7 silhouettes on horseback, tiny against a bleeding sun. No words, no logos. It was enough to stop the internet cold. After 6 years of silence, the world exhaled a single sentence. They're doing it again. What followed was the longest tease in modern gaming history. A trailer that didn't explain, only suggested. Snowfields, lanterns, a train, the voice of a man saying, "Listen to me. When the time comes, you gotta run and don't look back." Fans dissected every frame, every flicker of dust. Was it a sequel? A prequel? Who was this new voice? The speculation became its own campfire, burning for 2 long years while Rockstar crafted the largest, most detailed world they had ever attempted. Behind the scenes, hundreds of artists and programmers were rebuilding the frontier from the ground up. They weren't just aiming for realism. They were chasing intimacy. The first Red Dead Redemption had captured the loneliness of a man at the end of his story. The next would capture the vast, messy life that came before. They built snow that clung to coats and melted under lamplight, mud that remembered footprints, conversations that shifted depending on how tired your horse sounded. They wrote thousands of lines of ambient dialogue for gang members warming their hands at a fire. They built weather systems that changed not only the sky, but the mood of everyone beneath it. And at the center of it all stood a man who didn't want to be a hero. Arthur Morgan. Broad-shouldered, soft-spoken, loyal to a fault. A man trying to be good in a world that had forgotten what good meant. His story would stretch across 2 discs, 2 generations of consoles, and an ocean of player emotions. He wasn't designed to replace John Marston. He was designed to explain him, to show the family, the loyalty, and the loss that shaped the man we'd already mourned. When Red Dead Redemption 2 opened in 2018, it did something unheard of for a blockbuster game. It began in the dark. No heroic ride, no grand overture, just a snowstorm. A group of fugitives stumbling through white oblivion, carrying the wounded, lighting fires to keep death at bay. The opening hours crawled deliberately, daring players to adjust their breathing to the game's slower rhythm. It was Rockstar whispering, "You can't rush grief." That pace became a philosophy. Days lasted longer. Rides stretched across real miles of landscape. You brushed your horse because you loved it, not because a meter told you to. You cooked, you hunted, you wrote in a journal. Every small act was a way of saying, "I'm still here." And because of that intimacy, the big moments, the gunfights, the betrayals, the long goodbyes, hit like thunder after hours of still air. Critics wrote about the graphics, the motion capture, the size of the map. But players talked about something else, the quiet. They talked about sitting by the camp at night, listening to the gang sing. They talked about Arthur sketching a flower in his notebook. They talked about how the world didn't treat them like a visitor, but like a citizen, someone with chores, with relationships, with mornings and nights. That grounded realism made the story's heartbreak inevitable, because when the gang began to crumble, it felt less like plot and more like life taking its course. Rockstar threaded old names through the new tale. Dutch van der Linde, Javier, Bill, and finally John. You watched history circle back on itself. Each familiar face carried the faint shimmer of tragedy, because you already knew where their paths ended. But still, the game invited hope. Maybe this time things would turn out differently. Maybe Arthur could escape the cycle that doomed Marston. For dozens of hours, you believed it. And that belief, that fragile hope, is what makes Red Dead Redemption 2 so haunting. It's a prequel that feels like prophecy. Technically, it was a miracle. The Rage engine evolved into something almost cinematic, painting sunsets that felt hand-brushed. Sound design blurred into symphony. The hiss of rain on canvas, the clatter of cutlery, the soft call of a whip-paw will at dusk. No moment was too small for care. Even the pause before Arthur mounts his horse carries a touch of humanity. A sigh, a hesitation, a thought unsaid. But beyond the technology, there was courage in the storytelling. Rockstar dared to make a game about mortality, about the slow acceptance of endings. Arthur's illness, his fading strength, his quiet moments of forgiveness. These were not typical power fantasy beats. They were eulogies spoken by a man still alive. And when his story finally gave way to John's, the circle closed with devastating grace. Players didn't cry because of spectacle. They cried because they had lived alongside these people long enough to forget where fiction ended. When Red Dead Redemption 2 finally released, it wasn't just a sequel. It was a conversation with the first game, an echo across time. It took everything Red Dead Redemption had whispered about guilt and fate and turned it into a symphony. And like all great westerns, it ended not with triumph but with silence. A sunrise, a breath, a lingering shot of open land. The ride was over, but the world kept turning, slow and indifferent, just as it should. Even now, years later, players still talk about the ending not as a cutscene, but as an experience they lived through. They talk about burying Arthur on that hillside, the light filtering through pines, the camera pulling back to show the endless horizon. They talk about feeling both broken and peaceful, like they'd said goodbye to an old friend who finally found rest. That's the strange gift of the series. Its endings don't feel like loss. They feel like understanding. And somewhere deep in Rockstar's offices, as the credits rolled for the first time, someone must have looked up from their monitor and realized they had done it again. They had built not just another game, but another elegy, one that expanded the myth while keeping its heart intact. The long tease was over. The dream that started with a half-finished prototype and a question about redemption had come full circle, blooming into something vast and deeply human. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the last notes of the score. Pedal steel and cello folding into one another, the wind rising to take their place. The horses stop, the fire crackles low, and for a moment, there's nothing left to do but breathe and watch the sky change colors above the dying camp. Part 5. The sound of the empty plains. When people talk about Red Dead Redemption, they often speak of its story, its characters, its realism. But what lingers long after the credits is the sound of the world when nothing at all is happening. That hush between hoofbeats, that long exhale of wind moving through dry grass, the rustle of canvas when the camp shifts in its sleep. The game does something rare. It treats silence not as absence, but as presence, a living element, a language all its own. Every open world hums differently. Some roar with traffic and chatter, others pulse with score. But the frontier breathes. It inhales when you ride out at dawn, and exhales when night folds over the plains. It is never entirely still, just steady, like a heartbeat buried under layers of sand and memory. The developers understood that to make a player believe in a place, you have to let the air move first. So they mix that air like music. At the heart of that mix is Woody Jackson, the quiet architect of Red Dead's auditory soul. He didn't compose songs so much as weather systems. He began by listening to the creak of old leather chairs in his studio, to the buzz of a light bulb, to the way a steel string guitar rang when he played it with the back of a knife instead of a pick. He recorded imperfections on purpose, the scrape of fingers sliding between frets, the whisper of a mic catching breath. Each sound was human, raw, unpolished, like the land itself. Jackson once described the score as music you could walk through. And that's exactly how it feels. A single tremolo guitar can hang in the air for a full minute, bending just enough to sound uncertain, like the horizon blurring in heat. A muted trumpet might wander in, linger on 3 or 4 notes, and fade before you realize it's gone. There are no choruses, no climaxes, just drift. Tones that travel beside you, keeping pace with your breathing. It's a kind of sonic mercy. Nothing chasing you, nothing demanding you stay awake. Just company. The brilliance lies in restraint. In most games, music is instruction. Fight here, run there, feel this now. But in Red Dead Redemption and its sequel, music is permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to feel without words. Permission to simply exist inside a moment. It seeps in like dusk light through cracks in a barn, turning everything gold for a heartbeat before fading into blue. Beneath that music lives a web of sounds most players never consciously notice, but would miss instantly if removed. Listen close. The whicker of your horse shifting weight, the tinkle of a spur striking a stone, a crow's lazy cry in the distance. When a rifle fires, its echo rolls outward for 3, 4, 5 seconds, folding over itself until it dies somewhere behind the hills. That echo tells you more about the world's size than any map could. You feel the emptiness not because it's quiet, but because sound takes so long to come home. During late development, audio designers went out into real deserts to capture that feeling. They recorded air, not wind, air. The faint hiss that fills your ears when you stand absolutely still in open country. They called it the silence track, and they layered it under everything, barely audible, but always there. If you remove it, the game feels smaller, like oxygen has been siphoned away. Leave it in, and the horizon expands. Even the animals join the composition. Coyotes don't just howl. They test the distance between themselves and you. Insects rise with the heat and vanish when cold creeps back. Cattle grunt in the distance, their low notes mixing with thunder to form an accidental chord. Everything participates. Nothing dominates. It's democracy in acoustics. 1,000 quiet citizens sharing the same space. At night, when the player sets up camp, the score often drops away completely. You're left with fire crackle, shift in saddle leather, the faint clink of tin. And that's enough, because after hours of gunfire and gallop, stillness feels like reward. You can almost feel your pulse sinking with the world's slower rhythm. Many players never realized how carefully that was engineered. Every campfire sound, every ember pop, was positioned so your brain reads it as safe, steady, rhythmic, like breathing. That's why these games make such good companions for sleepless nights. They slow the heart without you noticing. Then, just when comfort becomes complacency, a chord might arrive. Minor, unresolved. A reminder that peace is temporary, that the West is always ending. Jackson called it the note of departure. You'll hear it right before dawn, or in the seconds after a gunfight when the last echo fades. It's a sound of distance, of someone riding away. It hurts softly, the way nostalgia does. Players often say they left the game running just to listen, to the wind, the crickets, the creak of the world turning. Some used it as meditation, some as background for study or sleep. Without realizing it, they were participating in Rockstar's quiet experiment. Could a digital world produce genuine calm? The answer was yes, because the developers had composed not just for excitement, but for rest. They had written a lullaby into the code. Consider the mission pacing. Bursts of tension separated by long, unscored travel. Those stretches aren't filler. They're breathing room. When you ride from Valentine to Saint-Denis, the miles matter because the game refuses to hurry you. It lets your mind wander. You start noticing patterns, how the sound of hooves changes from dirt to plank road, how city air hums differently from prairie air. In that noticing, you become present, and presence becomes peace. Sound also defines the moral geography. In towns, everything overlaps. Pianos chatter, the shuffle of commerce. Out in the wild, each noise stands alone. You hear yourself think. That contrast mirrors the story's theme. Civilization versus freedom, noise versus silence, progress versus solitude. By the time the player reaches the end, they've learned the lesson unconsciously. The quieter the world becomes, the closer you are to truth. When Arthur writes in his journal, the scratching pencil becomes percussion. When he coughs, the mix drops all other frequencies, pulling you into his chest, making you feel how fragile breath can be. When John hums to himself in the epilogue, it's off-key but perfect, because the song isn't for us. It's for the dead he's carrying with him. Even the animals react to this subtle choreography. A flock of birds might lift right as a guitar note bends upward, a tiny duet between sight and sound. If you ever load up the game again and ride out alone at dusk, pause your horse, remove the HUD, and just listen. You'll hear a world held together by patience. No symphony swells, no cue insists on drama, just the sound of wind telling stories older than any script. It's humbling, that restraint. It reminds you that the land doesn't need us to sing. It already has its own music. And that's the secret heartbeat of Red Dead Redemption. Not the gunfire, not the missions, not even the dialogue, but the way the world sounds when you stop touching it. Is the purest moment of trust between creator and player. Silence that says, I'll hold the space if you hold your breath. Silence that invites you to rest. So as we sit by our own small fire tonight, let that silence settle. Let the air hum with memory. Somewhere out there, a coyote calls, another answers, and the plains carry the reply until it fades into dawn. That too is music, the sound of an empty world remembering itself. Part 6. The Online Frontier. When the credits faded and the last campfire died down, most players thought the ride was over. But Rockstar had one more trail in mind, a new frontier that would stretch beyond the single-player story and test whether the magic of the West could survive in company. It would be called Red Dead Online, and it arrived like dawn after a long night, slow, tentative, full of promise. At first, the idea sounded impossible. How do you take a world defined by loneliness and fill it with people without breaking its spell? How do you let strangers share a sunset without turning it into noise? The developers weren't sure either. They built systems on systems, servers and economies, an entire invisible railroad of code to carry players into the same horizon together. They dreamed of an online West where every rider was both actor and audience, a living stage lit by campfire glow and packet data. The beta opened in late 2018, just weeks after Red Dead Redemption 2 launched. Thousands of new outlaws stepped off the metaphorical train at once, blinking into the same golden light. They built characters, faces weathered by wind, hands scarred, eyes tired but curious. For the first time, the West wasn't a memory told by one man. It was a chorus of voices, 1,000 stories beginning all at once. At its best, it felt like a miracle. Players formed posses, riding side by side through weather that changed minute to minute. They hunted together, set up camps, shared coffee in the early morning fog. When storms rolled in, everyone leaned forward instinctively, squinting through rain. Proof that immersion can be communal. Some players became traders, others bounty hunters, collectors, naturalists, moonshiners. Each profession added another verse to the song of survival. Money was scarce, upgrades slower than the modern crowd expected. But that scarcity gave every saddlebag coin a story. Yet the experiment carried weight. An online world demands constant tending, and the frontier has a way of exhausting its keepers. While the single-player game could rest, Red Dead Online had to stay awake. Updates arrived in spurts, new roles, new outfits, occasional story missions. But the rhythm was uneven. Players, hungry for direction, began to fill the silence themselves. They hosted fashion shows in Valentine streets, staged in-game photography contests, reenacted duels at sundown. They built communities as sturdy as any saloon, Discord servers, role-play ranches, fan newspapers. The world thrived not because of constant content, but because people cared enough to make content out of stillness. There was beauty in that improvisation. If the main campaign was a crafted film, online was a campfire jam, loose, flawed, full of surprises. You'd be riding alone and suddenly hear gunfire on the horizon. You'd follow it, expecting chaos, and find two players reenacting a movie scene for screenshots. You'd stop, watch, tip your hat, and ride on. Moments like that made the servers feel human, imperfect and unpredictable, exactly like the West itself. But time, as always, wears things down. By 2021 and 2022, updates slowed to a crawl. Rockstar's focus drifted toward the next Grand Theft Auto, and the online frontier grew quiet. The community noticed first: empty changelogs, sparse newswire posts, unanswered questions. Players gathered in black outfits for virtual funerals, lining up in cemeteries to pay respects to a game still technically alive, but clearly aging. They called it #SaveRedDeadOnline, a digital vigil that spread across social media like smoke from a prairie fire. Thousands posted screenshots of sunsets and goodbyes. It wasn't anger they felt, not really. It was grief. The same kind that lingers after a beloved town closes its doors. In those days, logging in felt like walking through ruins that still remembered laughter. The saloon stood empty. The campfires burned lower. Yet there was comfort, too, in the quiet. Those who stayed behind treated the emptiness like a sacred trust. They took photographs, wrote letters in character, rode long distances just to see if the aurora still shimmered over Amberino. They found solace in being caretakers rather than conquerors. If the single-player game was about redemption, online had become about preservation. And preservation has its own kind of peace. Without pressure to chase levels or currency, players rediscovered the original rhythm. Ride, rest, repeat. They began scheduling slow rides, long caravans at walking speed across the map. No voice chat, only gestures. A line of silent riders moving through fog. A visual poem written in pixels and patience. You can find recordings of those journeys on video sites today. Lanterns bobbing, hooves splashing through creek beds, someone occasionally strumming a real guitar over the mic. It's strangely moving. You realize that even a fading world can offer serenity when people choose gentleness. Rockstar never officially closed the servers. They simply stopped adding to them. In a July 2022 statement, they admitted no major updates were planned. For some, that sounded like an ending. For others, it was permission. Permission to treat the world not as a service, but as a memory you can still visit. like an old frontier town left standing so travelers can wander its streets and listen for echoes. Years later, those echoes remain. The economy froze, but the sunsets didn't. The horses still snort clouds of breath on cold mornings. Campfire smoke still drifts sideways in the wind. If you log in tonight, you might still find another soul out there. A lone rider crossing the desert, hat tipped low, moving not toward mission markers, but toward the kind of silence only this world provides. Maybe you'll ride together for a while. Maybe you'll never learn each other's names. You'll part ways at the river, exchange a nod, and vanish into opposite directions. That's the essence of Red Dead Online. Connection measured not by words, but by presence. In its rise and its quiet decline, Online captured something the main games could only imply: that every frontier ends not with gunfire, but with forgetting. Servers age, data decays, but experiences linger like ghosts. Players become stories told by screenshots, camp names etched in memory. And maybe that's fitting. The West was always about impermanence. Boomtowns, trails gone cold, stars burning out one by one. In that sense, Red Dead Online wasn't a failure. It was a perfect echo of the world it portrayed. Beautiful, fragile, destined to fade. If you listen closely now, you can still hear it. The faint hum of a server somewhere, the digital equivalent of wind. The low shuffle of code keeping time like a heart that refuses to stop. It's quiet, yes, but not dead. It's resting, dreaming of riders who will one day return to see what's left of the fire they built together. And that's the legacy of the online frontier. Not chaos, not competition, but companionship. The knowledge that for a brief golden moment, thousands of strangers stood beneath the same virtual sky, heard the same thunder roll across the plains, and believed, if only for an instant, that the West had come alive again. So as the embers fade and the wind rises, remember them. Remember the laughter over proximity chat, the accidental alliances, the long rides in silence, because somewhere in the data, in a pocket of persistent code, the world is still waiting, not demanding, not pleading, just waiting. For one more campfire to be lit. Part 7. Ports, Price and Preservation. Every world, no matter how grand, eventually meets the limits of its own hardware. Discs age, consoles retire. What was once cutting edge becomes nostalgia sealed in plastic. But Red Dead Redemption refused to stay buried. Even after its digital dust settled, people kept asking the same gentle question: where can I play it now? For more than a decade, that question hung in the air like a ghost note. Fans begged for a remaster, a true restoration worthy of what the game meant to them. They wanted to see those dusky mesas in higher resolution, to hear the cicadas through modern speakers, to revisit John Marston's ride not as memory, but as presence. And yet, for years, silence. The West slept on older machines, its campfires glowing faintly through the fog of emulation. Then, in the summer of 2023, a spark, a simple announcement. Red Dead Redemption would return on PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. The news should have been joyous, a second sunrise for an old world, but the tone was complicated. Players were grateful and frustrated all at once. The port ran well, they said, but it wasn't what they had imagined. No remaster, no 60 frames, no visual overhaul. And the price, $50, felt heavy for a game that had already grown old enough to vote. Comment sections filled with sighs and sermons. Some called it greed, others called it preservation. Some simply shrugged and bought it anyway, because the frontier still called, and nostalgia has its own currency. And maybe that was the quiet truth hiding beneath the debate. People weren't paying for graphics, they were paying for access, for the chance to stand again on that porch at Beach's Hope and watch the light change. For many, replaying it on a handheld Switch felt almost poetic. A grand western shrunk to the size of your hands, the Great Plains compressed into pixels you could carry anywhere. You could sit on a train, earbuds in, and watch the same horizon John once rode toward, the soundtrack whispering through tiny speakers. It was like holding a photograph of the past rather than the past itself. But photographs matter. They remind us that memory can travel. A year later, in 2024, the dream many had whispered finally arrived. A PC version, official, polished, long overdue. It landed without fanfare, almost shyly, like an old rider dismounting at the edge of a camp already asleep. And yet the response was warm, grateful. Modders flooded in like settlers. They added sharper textures, new lighting models, reshaded skies that bled from violet to silver. Some simply replayed the original untouched, content to hear the wind in high fidelity at last. The West was awake again, breathing on modern machines, stretching its legs after years in the dark. Preservation in games is rarely simple. Unlike books or film, interactive worlds depend on machinery that keeps aging out of existence. Servers close, formats die, rights expire. A single missing codec can strand an entire decade of memories. Developers talk about it like archaeologists talk about erosion, inevitable, tragic, and somehow beautiful. Because every attempt to save a world is also a reminder that worlds end. But Rockstar's return to the original Red Dead Redemption wasn't just about commerce or nostalgia. It was a statement. This story still matters. In an age of live services and endless updates, they chose to reissue a self-contained journey. A game that begins, ends, and means something in between. That alone felt radical. And for those who never owned an Xbox or a PlayStation 3, it was a first invitation to one of gaming's quiet masterpieces. New players stepped onto the prairie for the first time, unaware of all the debates, simply listening to the wind. They fell in love the same way everyone did back in 2010. Slowly, completely. What's remarkable is how well it all still holds. The pacing, once called slow, now feels timeless. The writing, once considered pulp, now reads like folklore. Even the graphics, softened by years, have aged into something painterly. There's a warmth in their imperfection, the haze around the sun, the rough edge of a shadow. That modern sharpness sometimes forgets. The port reminded the world that beauty doesn't always need revision. Sometimes it only needs to be witnessed again. And so, preservation becomes not just a technical act, but a moral one. To keep a world alive is to honor everyone who built it. The animators who modeled dust, the writers who penned quiet lines, the musicians who gave silence a key signature. Is to admit that games are not disposable experiences, but living memories that deserve caretakers. Every re-release, every patch, every mod is an act of stewardship, a way of saying, we were here, and we remember. Even now, in 2025, new players continue to discover the series for the first time. Some through streaming, some through ports, some through the tales of friends who whisper, you have to see this ending. And when they do, they feel the same pull we all did, that strange mixture of loss and peace that only Red Dead Redemption can conjure. The West may fade, the consoles may die, but the feeling survives. The hush before sunrise, the slow ride home. Preservation, after all, is a kind of redemption. It says that even the past deserves a second chance. And maybe that's the truest legacy of the series. Not just a tale of cowboys and consequences, but proof that art can outlive its machines if we care enough to carry it forward. So if you ever boot up an old copy or launch the new one, take a moment before the title screen. Listen to the wind behind the menu music. That's time itself, humming softly, reminding you that the frontier never really closes. It just changes hands. Part 8. The Ledger. Sales and Legacy. Every journey leaves a ledger behind. Not the kind with dollars and decimals, though those exist too, but the invisible sort, the one written in hearts moved, hours lived, moments remembered. For Red Dead Redemption, that ledger is heavy, not just with numbers but with meaning, because somehow what began as a strange, risky western became one of the most beloved stories ever told through pixels and patience. By 2025, the Red Dead series had sold over 100 million copies across the world. It is the kind of number you can barely visualize. Millions of campfires lit, millions of sunsets watched, millions of players who heard Arthur's last words and sat in silence. But numbers are only the surface of the truth. Behind each copy sold is a small act of surrender, a player saying, "I'll go where this story takes me." It's a quiet kind of faith, the kind that art lives or dies on. When Red Dead Redemption 2 launched in 2018, it became more than a sequel. It was a cultural event, a phenomenon that stretched beyond gaming into music, photography, and even academia. Professors wrote papers on its depiction of moral decay. Artists painted its landscapes from memory. Photographers studied its lighting engine to understand how digital sunrises could feel realer than real ones. Somewhere between technology and storytelling, the game crossed an invisible border. It stopped being entertainment and started being a meditation. Rockstar had created something larger than a product. They'd built a mirror, and when people looked into that mirror, they saw pieces of themselves, their weariness, their hope, their contradictions. Arthur Morgan became an archetype not of heroism, but of self-awareness. He wasn't the cowboy who tamed the wild. He was the man who realized the wild had been tamed long ago and wondered what was left for men like him. That vulnerability, that aching honesty, made players feel something that games rarely allow. Empathy for imperfection. Critics often compare Red Dead Redemption 2 to great Western cinema. Unforgiven, the assassination of Jesse James, No Country for Old Men. But it also belongs beside quieter masterpieces. The Grapes of Wrath, The Road, Blood Meridian. Stories about people out of time walking through the wreckage of progress. Rockstar took that literary sadness and built a place where you could inhabit it. You didn't just watch Arthur's life unfold. You lived in it, breathed its air, carried its dust under your fingernails. You wrote in his journal and realized, line by line, that it was your handwriting too. And that's where the game's legacy becomes truly remarkable. Because what people remember most is not spectacle or scale. It's tenderness. They remember giving a coin to a beggar. They remember helping a stranger with a broken wagon. They remember stopping to pat their horse before a dangerous mission, just in case it was the last time. Those moments didn't earn points or achievements. They were simply human, and they mattered. In an industry obsessed with speed and systems, Red Dead Redemption 2 slowed everything down until empathy could catch up. It asked you to watch your step, to clean your rifle, to share stew at the fire. In doing so, it reminded players that stillness is part of the story too, that reflection is as heroic as action, that design philosophy is rippled outward, subtly shaping a generation of developers. You can see its fingerprints on modern open-world games, slower pacing, richer NPC lives, worlds that breathe even when you're not watching. It's as if Rockstar's Campfire taught the whole industry to lower its voice and listen for a while. And then there's the community, the quiet army of fans who refuse to let the light go out. They've turned the Red Dead universe into something communal, generative, alive. There are roleplay servers that run 24 hours a day, populated by outlaws, sheriffs, and townsfolk who've built entire economies of imagination. There are digital photographers who spend days chasing perfect sunsets, composing screenshots like oil paintings. There are YouTubers who analyze the physics of horses, linguists who trace the dialects of side characters, musicians who reinterpret Woody Jackson's score on violins and banjos. Each of them adds a brushstroke to the painting. Each of them keeps the campfire warm. And of course, there are the stories that ripple outward beyond the screen. The people who say the game helped them through grief, or loneliness, or sleepless nights. They talk about how it gave them a place to go when the real world felt too loud, how it let them sit under a virtual sky and remember someone they'd lost. That's a kind of legacy no ledger can measure. When art becomes sanctuary, it transcends success. It becomes mercy. Financially, the numbers astonish. Billions in revenue, tens of millions of units, awards lining shelves. But behind those figures are years of labor, of artists who spent entire careers perfecting how dust settles on a boot. Their names scroll by in the credits, hundreds long, a moving monument of effort. You can almost imagine them as a caravan of modern pioneers, animators, writers, testers, sound engineers, each one pushing the frontier of possibility a little further. The ledger belongs to them most of all. Yet even monuments weather. Rockstar, like all studios, moves forward. The world waits for whatever comes next. Rumors of a new Grand Theft Auto, whispers of new technologies. But Red Dead Redemption remains their soul. The quiet proof that blockbuster ambition and poetic stillness can coexist. It is their heartbeat, echoing softly beneath the noise of everything else. And so we measure legacy not just in copies sold, but in echoes made. In the way people talk about the game years later, their voices lowering without meaning to, as if recounting a prayer. In the screenshots printed on walls, the fan art turned to tattoos, the covers played by campfire light. In the moments of a silence after Arthur's final ride, when even players who never cry feel something heavy and true settle in their chest. Those are not sales figures, they're testaments. Maybe someday the servers will close. Maybe the disc will stop spinning. But the memory will keep galloping forward, carried by every person who once paused to watch a digital sunrise and felt, for a heartbeat, the same wonder the artist felt while building it. That is how stories survive. Not through hardware, but through the people who loved them enough to retell them. If you were to open that invisible ledger tonight, you'd see no dollar signs, no marketing stats, just a list of names written in campfire smoke and moonlight. Names of players, developers, dreamers, names of horses and outlaws, of every soul that rode into the horizon and never quite came back. At the bottom of that page, a single line written in quiet script. The West was never about who owned it. It was about who remembered it, and that's what the Red Dead series has become. A shared memory. Not perfect, not endless, but enduring. A memory of how art can make even digital dust feel sacred. The fire's down to embers now. The stars have claimed the sky, and the plains have gone quiet, except for the low, steady hum of the wind. If you've ridden with us this far, then you already know the story never truly ends. It just waits for the next traveler to strike a match and begin again. Somewhere, a guitar string vibrates in the dark. Somewhere, a horse lifts its head at the sound. And somewhere, in all that distance, the ghosts of old stories rise like smoke and scatter into dawn. So rest easy, traveler. The West is still out there dreaming of you. Until next time, good night.